Today, on December 4th, we commemorate two great saints of our church. One of their icons here is St. Barbara the Great Martyr, who suffered in the 4th century, was actually martyred by her own pagan father. A very, very sad state of affairs when paganism was so vicious and malicious toward Christianity that even a father would take the life of his own daughter because she wouldn't renounce Christ. So she's a great martyr in our church. And the other saint is St. John of Damascus. Both are Syrian saints. I'd like to talk about St. John of Damascus a little bit. He's a very important saint for us. They both are, but he's one of the greatest fathers of the church. And we owe so much to him. And he led such an interesting life. He was born in Damascus. Now, when we think of Damascus today, we think of, this Muslim city and so on, but don't forget that when St. Paul, or Saul he was blinded by the light and knocked off his horse, he was on his way to Damascus to hunt Christians. So there were Christians in Damascus, even in the book of Acts. And when he finally gets there, Ananias is told by the angel to baptize Paul. So there's already a Christian community in Damascus, an ancient one, from the very first generation of Christians. So it was a very Christian city, and the Muslim conquest was very recent, just one generation since the Muslim conquest. And the vast majority of people in the area were Christians. Muslims were a very small minority initially, but they had taken control and they were in charge. But they were a very small part of the population. They just collected taxes and ruled over everybody else initially. His father was Sergius Mansur. That's where we get the name Mansur. Sometimes in Arabic, if you find Orthodox Christian Middle East, they'll refer to St. John of Damascus as Mansur, which is coming from his father's surname. So his father was a treasurer at the court of the Caliph, and Damascus was a center of the Caliphate. So it was like the capital city for the Middle East, and he was the treasurer under the Caliph. John had a foster brother. He was an orphan whom his father Cosmas had actually adopted. And he is also a saint in the church, commemorated on October 14th. So when these two boys were growing up, their father Sergius saw to it that they received the very best education. The inhabitants of the cities in the Middle East at this time were mostly Greek-speaking. And the inhabitants of the countryside were mostly Syriac-speaking, speaking Semitic languages. The small towns, the farms, and so on. But the cities were very, very Hellenized. And so classical Greek was still held in high regard in the cities. And they received this classical Greek education, but of course their father was Christian. So they also received a very good Christian education. And it's interesting who taught them. His father bought a slave in the slave market of Damascus, who was a Greek monk from southern Italy, from Calabria, who had been taken in a raid and was on the auction block. And when he found out how well educated he was, because southern Italy at this time was largely Greek-speaking, it wasn't Latin-speaking. It was a very mixed population. So he was a Greek monk, and his name was also Cosmas, and he taught them both in religious and secular education. It was seen that the boys really were very good students, quick learners, were very, very intelligent, and learned ancient Greek, classical Greek very, very well, and also all the other subjects at the time. And after the death of his father, John also occupied a high ministerial post at the Caliphate, at the court of the Caliph. And he even became the city prefect of the capital city. So he was like mayor of the capital city. In Constantinople during his lifetime is when iconoclasm broke out, where the emperors in Constantinople began to destroy images and persecute those who kept icons, and began to destroy so much of ancient Christian art. It was very tragic, both in the churches and in homes and everywhere else. They had bonfires of icons, and they would actually chisel out frescoes, and everything was very sad. And this went on for a century or more. But in the very first period of this, it was during his lifetime. And he wrote extensively defending the icons. And he wrote actually 3 treatises called Against Those Who Revile the Holy Images, or the Holy Icons. And it was his theological arguments that even though the Christians in Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire intuitively knew that it's okay to have icons, they didn't have the theological arguments really to be able to explain it theologically. The biggest defenders of icons in the Byzantine Empire were women and sailors and monastics, monks and nuns. So you had, the ones who broke the most were the men in the army. The army was very much in support of iconoclasm, and they were very much in support of the emperor's policies. But John wrote extensively in defense of icons. And later in life, not very much later, but at some point, he gave away all of his family's wealth. Remember, his father was treasurer of the caliphate. He gave away all of his riches to the poor and to the church. And then he went to Jerusalem with his foster brother and fellow student Cosmas. And he entered the monastery of Mar Sava, Saint Savas the Sanctified, in the Judean desert, not far from the Dead Sea, not far from where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. They're still there. It's a huge monastery. I've been there several times with Father Theodore. It's a very moving experience, very ancient. Lots of hermit cells in this canyon, huge monastery complex. You could see at one time there were 1,000 monks or more there. And it was still highly populated when he went there. So that's where he went, and that's where he spent the rest of his days. And he was very humble. He came from this very high background, but he was told to be under complete obedience. And but at some point he wrote, when one of the monks died, one of the monks who was very, very attached to that monk asked him to compose special hymns for the monk who had died. And that's what's contained in our funeral service. He wrote those. And he wrote them at the request of a brother monk because of a monk who was very dear to him who died. And he got in trouble with the abbot because he didn't have a blessing to do that. So he was giving punishment, no more writing any hymns, no more writing any books, nothing. You're to clean the toilets. So he cleaned the toilets of the monastery with humility for a long time until finally an angel revealed to the abbot to let him write. He has important things to write, and he did. So he relented. But that shows you his humility. She's a very unique person. So basically most of the funeral service, all the special hymns, the special stikara that we sing, what is this life to be like? They're very poetic, very deep theological meaning. He composed those. And they still have the cave in which he lived for 30 years. I call it a cave. It's like the size of a grave. I've been in it. It's in the church. The church is actually built over it's actually the back of the church. You go down these steps into something the size of a grave. There's room for 2 people to sit there. And I remember when one of the monks brought us one at a time into his cell that he lived in for 30 years. And we went there with 2 lit candles like he would carry on Pascha. And we went down, we sat in his cave. It's pitch black with our 2 little candles. And he said, imagine, this is where he wrote our funeral service, from within a grave. It was very moving. So, but St. John, he wrote our funeral service, and yet he wrote the Paschal canon that we sing at midnight on Pascha. This joyful celebration of the resurrection from his grave. His actual cell, his actual cave, was no bigger than a grave. And that's where he wrote the Paschal canon. He actually wrote many of the canons of the church, and he actually incorporated them into our services as a part of the Matin service. We have these canons, these wonderful canons of saints and so on. He wrote extensively for hymnography. Many of our hymns of the church, our liturgical hymns, come from him. He wrote many important books. And when he died, he was born around 680, and when he died, he was around 780. 100 years old, and of old age in the monastery. So he's a towering figure in the church for three reasons, major reasons. He wrote a dogmatic work in three parts called The Font of Knowledge. The first part is called Philosophical Chapters, and it deals with logic and essentially preparing readers for the rest of the book. The second part of the book on heresies or on errors in theology. And the last chapter of that section contains the first refutation of Islam, which he knew very well. He knew Islam very well. He was at the court of the Caliph in Damascus. He knew Islam inside and out. He knew what they believed, but in his arguments, he explained that it was false and why Christianity is the true faith. And so the third part, an exact exposition of the Orthodox faith, is a classic. He outlines basically all the teachings of our church in a most wonderful way, built on earlier church fathers. And so it's a real classic. It's available in English translation. I'm sure it's also in Romanian and many other languages, and Russian, and Ukrainian too, I'm sure. So living it, and then those were his major works. And then he lived outside the boundaries of the East Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, where the Byzantine army was carrying out the emperor's will, smashing icons and persecuting anyone who had icons. So he was out of reach of the heretical emperors, who really were enraged at him for his writings, and he was giving people the theological ammunition they needed to defend the faith. But he was able to get his writings, and they spread, and people were copying them in monasteries and spreading throughout the empire to give people strength to defend the veneration of icons. He wrote three apologetic, which means defensive treatises against those who revile the holy icons, as I said. And it would be an exaggeration to claim that his role in the controversy was crucial, that he was the deciding factor, but he certainly had made a very effective argument and helped win the day for Orthodox Christianity. And the third thing he was so noted for was that he was a wonderfully gifted hymnographer, both in his theology and his poetry. For instance, he played a major part in establishing the canon as part of Orthodox worship, as I told you. He composed the hymns of the Otoi, the Book of 8 Tones for the Resurrection. He wrote those, the ones that we sing every Saturday night in Vespers. And he composed this idea of the 8 tones and really compiled a lot of these hymns that we use in the church. And it set a model for later compositions by others. And as I said, he wrote the Easter canon, the golden canon that we sing at midnight on Pascha. And he wrote most of the burial service, but he also wrote some of our most beautiful and familiar hymns to the Mother of God, the Theotokos, the Bogorodice. And interesting, the other saint of the day, the major saint of the day, St. Barbara, the great martyr, was from his area. And he wrote a beautiful encomium for her, even though she lived 4 centuries earlier. He had a great devotion to St. Barbara. And they had the same feast day, which is very interesting. So I just want to share with you, to conclude, just an extract from his exposition of the Orthodox faith on what the Son of God achieved. He said, after all those years of darkness of paganism, he said, now the adoration of demons and false gods has ceased. Creation has been sanctified by the divine blood of Christ. The altars and temples of idols have been overthrown. The knowledge of God, the consubstantial Trinity, has been planted in our minds. The uncreated divinity, the one true God, creator and Lord of all, is worshipped. Virtues are cultivated. The hope of resurrection has been granted through the resurrection of Christ. The demons who once held us in captivity now tremble. And what is miraculous indeed is that all this has been successfully brought about by his cross and passion and death. Throughout the whole earth, the gospel of the knowledge of God has been preached, not through wars or weapons or armies being used to rout the enemy, but by only a few naked, poor, illiterate men, persecuted, tormented, who at the risk of death preached him who was crucified in the flesh and died, and who thus became victors over the wise and the powerful of this world. For the omnipotent power of Christ crucified, accompanied them. Death, which was once the thing that we humans feared above all else, has been overthrown. That which was once the object of hate and loathing is now preferred to life. These are the achievements of Christ's presence. These are the tokens of his power. For it is not one people that he has saved, as when through Moses he divided the sea and delivered Israel out of the hand of Egypt and the bondage of Pharaoh. Rather, he has rescued all of humanity, both Jews and Gentiles, from the corruption of death and the bitter tyranny of sin. Not bringing them to virtue by force, not burying them with earth or burning them with fire, or ordering the sinners to be stoned, but by persuading us by gentleness and long-suffering to choose virtue, to outdo one another to attain it, and to find pleasure in doing so. Formerly it was sinners who were persecuted, and yet they clung all the closer to sin, which they looked upon as their God. But now, for the sake of piety and virtue, people choose persecution, disfigurement, and death. All praise to you, O Christ, the divine word, wisdom and power, and almighty God. What can we, who are so impoverished, give in return for all this? For all things are yours, and you ask nothing of us other than that we be saved. It is you who give this, yet in your unutterable goodness, you are grateful to those who receive it. We are thankful to you for granting us our existence and true life. When we fell away from this, you brought us back to it by your ineffable kindness and love for humankind. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.